George Washington, the man who could have been king but chose to be a citizen. Do you ever wonder what it takes to build something from nothing, to create something that has never existed before? Let me tell you the story of a man who had the chance to become a king, to rule for life with absolute power, but instead chose to walk away. A man who could have held on to power forever, but decided that the idea of freedom was more important than his own glory. This man is George Washington, the father of a nation, the general who won an impossible war, and the president who set the standard for every leader who came after him. His story is not just about military victories or political achievements. It's about character. It's about choosing principle over personal gain. It's about understanding that true leadership means knowing when to step forward and when to step back. Today, we will walk through his extraordinary journey. We'll talk about his humble beginnings, the impossible war he fought and won, the nation he helped create, and the moment when he shocked the world by voluntarily giving up power. By the time you finish this story, you'll not only know George Washington's life, but you'll also understand that the most powerful choice a leader can make is to serve something greater than themselves. And remember, as we go along, keep learning from his example. Just like George Washington believed that actions speak louder than words, let his life speak to yours about what true leadership really means. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, into a world very different from the one he would help create. His father, Augustine Washington, was a tobacco planter who owned several plantations and slaves. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was Augustine's second wife, a strong-willed woman known for her stern discipline and religious devotion. The Washington family wasn't among Virginia's wealthiest, but they were comfortable. They were part of the colonial gentry, that class of landowners who had servants, nice homes, and social standing, but they weren't aristocrats with titles or vast fortunes. Young George grew up on Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia. His childhood was spent doing what most sons of planters did, learning to ride horses, exploring the woods along the Rappahannock River, and beginning to understand the business of running a plantation. But when George was just 11 years old, his father died suddenly. This death changed everything. George's older half-brothers inherited the best properties. George's formal education, which had never been extensive, essentially ended. While wealthy Virginia boys were sent to England for schooling, George would never attend college, he would never travel to Europe. His education came from practical experience and self-study. This early loss taught George something important. He would have to make his own way in the world. Nobody was going to hand him success. He would have to earn it. As a teenager, George was tall for his age. He would eventually reach 6 feet 2 inches, towering over most men of his era. He was strong, athletic, and excellent with horses. But what really set him apart was his discipline and his desire to improve himself. George began keeping a notebook where he copied down rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. 110 rules about how to conduct himself properly. Rules like, every action done in company ought to be done with some sign of respect to those that are present, and labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. Think about that. A teenage boy writing down rules for how to be a good person, how to show respect, how to maintain his integrity. This wasn't someone seeking shortcuts. This was someone building himself into the person he wanted to become. At 16, George found his first career, surveying. He joined a team measuring and mapping the vast wilderness of Virginia's frontier. This was dangerous work. Traveling through unmapped forests, dealing with harsh weather, occasionally encountering hostile Native Americans. But George loved it. Surveying taught him to be precise, methodical, and observant. It taught him about the land itself, the mountains, rivers, and valleys that would later become critical knowledge during war. And it taught him to be comfortable with hardship. Nights spent camping in the wilderness, days spent trudging through rough terrain. This built the physical and mental toughness he would need later. By age 17, George was appointed the official surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia. He was earning good money and beginning to buy his own land. He understood that in colonial America, land was wealth and power. In 1751, when George was 21, he traveled with his beloved half-brother Lawrence to Barbados. Lawrence had tuberculosis, and they hoped the Caribbean climate might help him recover. This trip to Barbados would be the only time George Washington ever left the North American continent. In Barbados, George contracted smallpox. He survived, but the disease left his face slightly scarred. However, surviving smallpox gave him immunity, something that would prove crucial during the Revolutionary War when smallpox decimated armies. Tragically, the trip didn't save Lawrence. He died in 1752, and George inherited Mount Vernon, the beautiful estate on the Potomac River that would become his beloved home. At 20, George Washington was a landowner with his own estate, but he wanted more than just to be a planter. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted distinction. In 1753, the British governor of Virginia gave 21-year-old George a dangerous mission: travel to the Ohio frontier and deliver a message to French forces who were encroaching on British-claimed territory. This was no simple errand. It meant hundreds of miles through winter wilderness, across icy rivers, through territories where one wrong step could mean death. George accepted immediately. He led a small party through brutal conditions, nearly drowned crossing a freezing river, was shot at by a French-allied Native American, and barely made it back alive. But he completed the mission. He delivered the message and returned with crucial intelligence about French military positions. The governor was impressed. When fighting broke out between British and French forces in 1754, the start of what would become the French and Indian War, George was given command of a military unit despite having no formal military training. This is where George Washington's military career truly began, and it began with a disaster. In his first major engagement, George's forces ambushed a French diplomatic party, killing several men, including a French officer. The French claimed it was an unprovoked attack on diplomats. George insisted he was following orders to intercept French forces. Either way, it sparked open warfare. Shortly after, French and Native American forces surrounded Washington's hastily built Fort Necessity. Outnumbered and outgunned, George was forced to surrender, the only surrender of his military career. He signed a document in French, which he couldn't read, that essentially admitted to assassinating the French officer. George returned to Virginia in disgrace. He was 22 years old, and his military career seemed finished before it really started. But George didn't quit. When the British sent General Edward Braddock to push the French out of the Ohio Valley in 1755, George volunteered to join his staff. He wanted to learn from a professional British officer. He wanted a chance to redeem himself. The Braddock expedition ended in catastrophe. British forces, marching in tight formation through the wilderness, were ambushed by French and Native American forces. General Braddock was killed. The army panicked and ran. But George Washington, despite being sick with dysentery, rallied the troops. He had 2 horses shot out from under him. 4 bullets tore through his coat, yet he remained calm under fire, organizing the retreat and saving what was left of the British force. A minister who was there later wrote, "I expected every moment to see him fall, but he survived, and I now believe he is preserved for some great purpose." George's courage that day made him famous throughout Virginia. At 23, he was appointed commander of all Virginia forces, responsible for defending 300 miles of frontier with just a few hundred men. It was an impossible task, but George did his best. For 3 years, he learned the hard lessons of command. He learned that leadership means making difficult decisions with incomplete information. He learned that soldiers respect leaders who share their hardships. He learned that reputation matters, but results matter more. In 1758, George was part of a successful British expedition that finally captured the French Fort Duquesne. With that mission accomplished, and with growing frustration at how the British military treated colonial officers as inferior, George resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon. He was done with military life, or so he thought. In January 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. Martha brought wealth, social connections, and stability to George's life. She also brought her children, Jackie and Patsy, whom George loved as his own, though he and Martha would never have biological children together. For the next 16 years, George focused on being a Virginia gentleman planter. He managed Mount Vernon, expanded his land holdings, served in Virginia's colonial legislature, and lived the life of a prosperous colonial American. But George was also paying attention to the growing tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain. The British government, deep in debt from the French and Indian War, decided the colonies should help pay for their own defense. They imposed new taxes: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Each new tax sparked colonial protests. George opposed these taxes on principle. He believed that as British subjects, colonists had the right to representative government, the fundamental British principle of no taxation without representation. Parliament was taxing Americans without giving them any voice in that parliament. But George wasn't a radical. He didn't want independence. He wanted the British government to respect colonial rights. He hoped for reconciliation, not revolution. Then came 1773 and the Boston Tea Party, when colonists dumped British tea into Boston Harbor to protest tea taxes. The British response was harsh. They closed Boston's port, dissolved Massachusetts' legislature, and sent troops to occupy the city. George watched with growing alarm. If the British could do this to Massachusetts, they could do it to any colony. Colonial rights meant nothing if they could be revoked at will. In 1774, George was elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress, where representatives from 12 colonies gathered to coordinate their response to British policies. George said little during these debates, but people noticed him. He was tall, dignified, and composed. When he did speak, people listened. When the Second Continental Congress met in May 1775, fighting had already broken out. In April, British soldiers and colonial militiamen had exchanged fire at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. War had begun, whether anyone wanted it or not. The Congress needed to create a continental army and choose a commander-in-chief. The logical choice seemed to be someone from Massachusetts, where the fighting was happening. But John Adams, a Massachusetts delegate, understood that this couldn't just be a New England war. If all 13 colonies were going to unite, the commander needed to be from the South. He nominated George Washington. It was a brilliant political move. George was from Virginia, the largest and most powerful Southern colony. He was the only delegate who wore his military uniform to Congress, signaling his readiness to serve. He had military experience, he was wealthy enough that he couldn't be bought, and his character was beyond reproach. On January 15, 1775, George Washington elected George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. George accepted, but with characteristic humility he told Congress he did not think himself equal to the command I am honored with. He refused a salary, asking only that Congress reimburse his expenses. Then he made the long ride to Massachusetts to take command of the forces besieging Boston. What George found there was shocking. This wasn't an army. It was a mob. Thousands of militiamen from different colonies with no uniform, little discipline, and varying amounts of ammunition and supplies. Officers were elected by their men and hesitated to discipline them. Soldiers came and went as they pleased. George immediately began imposing order. He established clear chains of command. He required discipline and military courtesy. He drilled the troops constantly. Some soldiers resented this. They had come to fight British tyranny, not to be ordered around by some Virginia aristocrat. But George understood something crucial. Enthusiasm alone doesn't win wars. Training, discipline, and organization win wars. The challenge George faced was almost impossible. He was fighting the most powerful military in the world with an army that was poorly equipped, poorly trained, and constantly changing as soldiers' enlistments expired. The British had professional soldiers, the world's most powerful navy, and seemingly unlimited resources. George had farmers and shopkeepers with muskets. But George also had advantages. He was fighting on his own territory. He knew the land from his surveying days. His soldiers were fighting for their homes and families, while British soldiers were fighting for pay, far from home. In March 1776, George achieved his first major success. He secretly fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston, and positioned captured artillery there. When the British woke up to see cannons pointing down at their positions, they realized Boston was indefensible. They evacuated the city without a fight. George had liberated Boston, but the hardest part was just beginning. In July 1776, as George prepared to defend New York City, Congress took a momentous step. They declared independence from Britain. There would be no reconciliation now. This was revolution. If they lost, they would all hang as traitors. The British responded by sending the largest military force ever deployed to North America, over 400 ships and 32,000 soldiers. Against this, George had about 20,000 troops, many of them untrained and poorly equipped as soldiers' enlistments expired. The British had professional soldiers, the world's most powerful navy, and seemingly unlimited resources. George had farmers and shopkeepers with muskets. But George also had advantages. He was fighting on his own territory. He knew the land from his surveying days. His soldiers were fighting for their homes and families, while British soldiers were fighting for pay, far from home. In March 1776, George achieved his first major success. He secretly fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston, and positioned captured artillery there. When the British woke up to see cannons pointing down at their positions, they realized Boston was indefensible. They evacuated the city without a fight. George had liberated Boston, but the hardest part was just beginning. In July 1776, as George prepared to defend New York City, Congress took a momentous step. They declared independence from Britain. There would be no reconciliation now. This was revolution. If they lost, they would all hang as traitors. The British responded by sending the largest military force ever deployed to North America, over 400 ships and 32,000 soldiers. Against this, George had about 20,000 troops, many of them untrained and poorly equipped as soldiers' enlistments expired. The British had professional soldiers, the world's most powerful navy, and seemingly unlimited resources. George had farmers and shopkeepers with muskets. But George also had advantages. He was fighting on his own territory. He knew the land from his surveying days. His soldiers were fighting for their homes and families, while British soldiers were fighting for pay, far from home. In March 1776, George achieved his first major success. He secretly fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston, and positioned captured artillery there. When the British woke up to see cannons pointing down at their positions, they realized Boston was indefensible. They evacuated the city without a fight. George had liberated Boston, But the hardest part was just beginning. In July 1776, as George prepared to defend New York City, Congress took a momentous step. They declared independence from Britain. There would be no reconciliation now. This was revolution. If they lost, they would all hang as traitors. The British responded by sending the largest military force ever deployed to North America, over 400 ships and 32,000 soldiers. Against this, George had about 20,000 troops, many of them untrained and poorly equipped, as soldiers' enlistments expired. The Battle of Long Island in August 1776 was a disaster for the Americans. They were outflanked and overwhelmed. George's entire army could have been captured, ending the revolution before it truly began. But George managed a brilliant nighttime retreat, evacuating his entire army across the East River to Manhattan under cover of darkness and fog. The British woke up to find their prey had escaped. For the rest of 1776, George retreated again and again. The British pushed him out of Manhattan, out of White Plains, across New Jersey. His army dwindled as soldiers deserted or their enlistments expired. By December, he had fewer than 3,000 men left, and their enlistments would expire on December 31st. The revolution was dying. One more defeat, and it would be over. George needed a victory, desperately. So on Christmas night 1776, he made a bold gamble. He would cross the ice-choked Delaware River and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. It was an insane plan. Cross a frozen river at night in the middle of winter, then march 9 miles to attack professional German soldiers in their fortified positions. But George knew he had no choice. Without a victory, the army would dissolve, and the revolution would end. On the night of Christmas 25, 1776, George's army crossed the Delaware in small boats, fighting ice floes and bitter cold. The password for the operation was victory or death. They attacked at dawn on December 26th. The Hessians, groggy from Christmas celebrations, were caught completely by surprise. In less than an hour, the battle was over. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured, and crucially, the Americans suffered only 5 casualties. The Battle of Trenton changed everything. It proved the Continental Army could win. Soldiers re-enlisted, new volunteers joined. The revolution had a second chance. But the war was far from over. For 6 more years, George would fight. At Valley Forge, in the winter of 1777 to 78, his army nearly starved and froze to death while Congress struggled to supply them. George walked among his suffering soldiers, seeing men without shoes leaving bloody footprints in the snow, and his heart broke for them. But he held the army together through sheer force of will. He wrote desperate letters to Congress, begging for supplies. He shared his soldiers' hardships, sleeping in a tent when he could have requisitioned a warm house. His men noticed. They grumbled, but they stayed. George lost more battles than he won, but he understood something crucial about this war. He didn't have to defeat the British. He just had to avoid being defeated until they gave up. It was a war of endurance, not conquest. In 1781, the opportunity George had waited for finally arrived. A large British army under Lord Cornwallis had fortified itself at Yorktown, Virginia, on a peninsula. French naval forces arrived and blocked the British escape by sea. George marched his combined American and French forces south and besieged Yorktown. For 3 weeks, American and French artillery pounded British positions. Finally, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army of over 7,000 men. The war was essentially over. Britain's will to continue fighting was broken. Peace negotiations began. In September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing American independence. The impossible had happened. A ragtag army of colonists had defeated the British Empire. And what did George Washington do next? He resigned. On December 23, 1783, George appeared before Congress in Annapolis and formally resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief. He said, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action. I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life." Then he went home to Mount Vernon, intending to spend the rest of his life as a farmer. This resignation shocked the world. King George III of England, when told that Washington planned to resign and return to his farm, said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Throughout history, generals who won wars seized power. Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon Bonaparte, successful generals became dictators or kings. George Washington could have done the same. His soldiers would have followed him anywhere. He could have declared himself king or military dictator. But George believed in something bigger than personal power. He believed in republican government, in civilian control of the military, in the idea that leaders should serve the people, not rule them. By voluntarily giving up power, George set a precedent that would define American democracy. Leaders serve and then step aside. But George's service to his country wasn't finished. While at Mount Vernon, he watched with growing concern as the new nation struggled. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was weak and ineffective. States fought with each other over trade and borders. The country was falling apart. In 1787, George agreed to serve as president of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where delegates would try to create a stronger national government. His presence gave the convention legitimacy. People trusted George Washington, so they trusted the document his convention produced. When the Constitution was ratified in 1788, everyone knew who the first president would be. In February 1789, George was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. Every single elector voted for him, the only president in American history to be elected unanimously. George didn't want the job. He was 57 years old, tired, and longing for the quiet life at Mount Vernon. But once again, duty called. He said, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." On April 30th, 1789, George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. He stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, placed his hand on a Bible, and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Everything about George's presidency set precedents. How should a president be addressed? Should he live in a palace? How much power should he have? Should he consult with advisors? George had to answer all these questions because nobody had been a president before. George chose to be called simply Mr. President, rejecting more royal-sounding titles. He established a cabinet system of advisors. He insisted on civilian control of the military. He refused to use his power for personal gain. Most importantly, George understood that he was establishing patterns that future presidents would follow. Every decision mattered because it would become a precedent. George served 2 terms as president, from 1789 to 1797. His administration faced enormous challenges, creating a functioning government from scratch, dealing with conflicts between France and Britain, handling the Whiskey Rebellion when farmers refused to pay federal taxes, managing conflicts between his advisors, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, who had radically different visions for America's future. Through it all, George tried to stay above partisan politics. He wanted to be president of all Americans, not just one faction. He worked to hold the fragile nation together. In 1796, George stunned many people by announcing he would not seek a 3rd term. He was tired, he was 64 years old, and longing for the quiet life at Mount Vernon. More importantly, he believed that stepping aside voluntarily would establish the principle that no one person was indispensable to the Republic. In his farewell address, published in newspapers across the country, George warned against political parties dividing the nation, against foreign entanglements pulling America into European wars, and against sectionalism tearing North and South apart. He wrote, "The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. In other words, you are Americans first, everything else second. On March 4, 1797, George attended the inauguration of his successor, John Adams. Then he climbed into his carriage and went home to Mount Vernon. This time, for good. George spent his final years doing what he loved most, managing his plantation, entertaining guests, and corresponding with friends. He freed all his slaves in his will, one of the few founding fathers to do so. On December 12, 1799, George rode around Mount Vernon inspecting his farms in snow and sleet. He developed a throat infection. 2 days later, on December 14, 1799, George Washington died at home, surrounded by friends and loved ones. His last words were, "'Tis well." He was 67 years old. The nation mourned. Congress wore black armbands for weeks. Across America and even in Europe, people grieved. Henry Lee delivered the famous eulogy: first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. George Washington's life teaches us timeless lessons. 1. Character matters more than charisma. George wasn't the most brilliant speaker or the most creative thinker among the founders, but his integrity, his self-discipline, and his willingness to sacrifice for principles made him indispensable. 2. True leadership means knowing when to step aside. George's voluntary relinquishment of power, twice, was his greatest act of leadership. He proved that in a republic, no one person is more important than the system. 3. Actions speak louder than words. George said less than most of his contemporaries, but his actions, his courage under fire, his endurance through hardship, and his integrity and power spoke volumes. 4. Success requires perseverance through failure. George lost more battles than he won, but he never quit. He understood that persistence matters more than perfection. 5. Duty sometimes requires personal sacrifice. Again and again, George left the home he loved to serve his country. He never sought power, but when his country needed him, he answered the call. George Washington wasn't perfect. He owned slaves for most of his life, though he grew increasingly uncomfortable with the institution. He could be aloof and formal. He worried constantly about his reputation. He had a temper he worked hard to control. But his greatness lay not in being perfect, but in consistently choosing principle over personal gain, duty over comfort, and service over power. When King George III called him the greatest man in the world for walking away from power, he understood something profound. It's easy to seize power. It's nearly impossible to voluntarily give it up. George Washington did it twice. That's his legacy, not just that he won a war or served as president, but that he showed the world what Republican virtue looks like in action. He proved that leaders could serve their people rather than rule them. He demonstrated that power should be temporary, not permanent. Every American president who has peacefully transferred power to a successor stands in George Washington's shadow. Every military leader who answers to civilian authority follows Washington's precedent. Every leader who chooses to step aside for the good of the institution honors Washington's example. This is not just George Washington's story. It's a blueprint for leadership in any context. Lead by example, choose principle over personal gain, know when your time is done, and have the courage to step aside. George Washington was once asked what he hoped his legacy would be. He said, "I hope I shall possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man." That's all he wanted, to be remembered as an honest man who did his duty. 2 centuries later, he's remembered as much more: the father of a nation, the general who won an impossible war, the president who set the standard, and the leader who proved that the highest form of power is knowing when to let it go. The question is, what will your legacy be? When the moment comes for you to choose between personal gain and principle, between holding on and letting go, between comfort and duty, what will you choose? George Washington showed us the way. Now, it's our turn to walk it.